Hey, it's Tim here. Today, we're finally doing it. We're getting started on Tableau Server. Yes, this is probably the most requested topic in general on my channel. Everyone always asks about Tableau Server. And for a long time, I've actually held off doing it because Tableau Server is a tricky topic to cover. So what I thought we'd do today is start with the most basic and probably the most asked question about Tableau Server, which is Tableau Server permissions. Now, this is very much a part one of the video, and I kind of need your help to inform part two. So if you watch this video and there's something missing, let me know in the comments below, because that will be helping inform where we take part two of this video. In part one, this video, what I want to do is cover the basics. Make sure that you understand the fundamental principles that work behind permissions in Tableau Server or Tableau Online. Now, these principles apply to both products. It doesn't matter whether you're using Tableau Server or Tableau Online. There are going to be some nuances, and we'll cover that later. But in this first video, we're just going to level the playing field for every single Tableau Server and Tableau Online setup, and just assume that we all have the same setup. And we are going to go and cover how Tableau Server evaluates permissions. All right, let's get stuck in. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just to talk very briefly about what we mean by permissions. In short, permissions control what you can and can't do on the server. Now, if you work in an enterprise setup, governance is an important part of that setup. And so being able to control who can see what and what they can do with that access is really, really important. Now, at the same time, you want to be able to manage this at scale. So you don't want to have to sit there and manually configure it for each and every individual person as they join or get access to the server. So there's also some elements of this which talk about people's roles. And when we talk about roles, we're talking about the level of access at a high level that someone has. For example, are they a viewer? Are they a creator? Are they a site admin? Are they a server admin? These are typically known as roles, and roles pretty much set the foreground for how your permissions work. Now, if we start at the very top, you've got someone like a server admin who is pretty much the boss level access, and they can access pretty much everything on the server. There are a few nuances for this, but again, we'll cover this in another video. The next level down is the site admin. Now, the site admin has access to a particular part of Tableau Server or Tableau Online. Now, if you have Tableau Online, you typically tend to only have access to a single site. And so that means the site admin is also the server admin in that case. And the server admin for Tableau Online doesn't have to do any sort of back-end tasks. So in many ways, Tableau Online tends to only really have site admin level access. And the admin at that level is pretty much going to be managing things using the interface. They don't have any access to the AWS server that Tableau are running Tableau Online on. However, on Tableau Server, the server admin has some additional tasks. They also have to be able to do things like install or upgrade the server. And so as well as having the ability to go into multiple sites on the server, they can also log into the back end of the server and carry out a few tasks. Now, sometimes this tends to be a group of people. It's not just one person, because of course, someone goes on holiday, you want to be able to cover them. So again, I'm not going to dive into this too much. I don't want to sort of get into the weeds about how roles and licensing works, but I just want you to have that general context because it's important for what we're about to cover next. The next level down from a site admin is a project owner, essentially someone who owns a particular project. And if I go over here to Tableau Online, you can see that if I go to my Explore folder here, you'll see that each one of these folders is essentially a project. If I open this up, you'll see that a folder is essentially got the same icon as a project. So a project owner is someone who has control over one of these spaces. Now, in more recent versions of Tableau Online and Tableau Server, you could actually create nested projects. What do I mean by that? Well, if I click into this, you'll see that I have another folder. That's essentially a folder inside of a folder, which means it's a project inside of a project, which makes it a nested project. Now, after you've got projects, you have content. So once you basically start to sort of navigate through all the content, you have things like workbooks, prep flows, data sources. Now, these are typically put there by what we know as content owners. So content owners are the people who've actually created the content. They tend to have the creator license. Now, that's not technically always true, but again, we'll leave the technicalities out of this video and we'll just assume a level playing field. So a creator will publish content onto Tableau Server or Tableau Online from Tableau Desktop or Tableau Prep or even Web Edit or Tableau Web Authoring. And when they publish content, what they're really doing is saving that content into a project. And so that makes them the content owner. And that content owner capability has a level of access over every other sort of permission. The next level down is pretty much who you are in the organization. So if you're just someone who's been given access to look at reports, you'll either be something which is an explorer or a viewer. Now, the difference between explorer and viewer, it's again another sort of technicality I'm going to leave out of this video. Yes, there's a few technicalities I'm skipping by because it'll just make the video too long, but nonetheless, explorers and viewers get access to access content. Explorers have a bit more access. They can do things like they can start to create content with the Explorer can publish license type, but they can also do things like navigate certain aspects that haven't necessarily been made available to viewers. An Explorer, for example, can download detailed summary data. Detailed summary data, that doesn't make sense, but they can essentially download the detail behind summary data. That's a better way to put it. And so those are the typical levels. Now, the reason I've gone through that in that order is because I'm going to be referencing them throughout this video. So it's really important to cover them up front. And as I start to reference them, you'll know roughly what I'm talking about. If you're thinking about, well, how can I find out what these permissions and roles are? If you head over to the permissions tab, in fact, let's not do that. If you just say Tableau server roles, let's just do that, you'll get this list, and it's actually a pretty well-defined list. If I go down here, you'll see that you have server admin, site administrator, creator, and then you have site roles which use an Explorer license, which is a server admin again, site admin, Explorer, and essentially goes down the list, viewer, unlicensed, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't include the content owner and stuff like that because that ends up being applied to the content model, whereas the roles typically stop at the roles of access that you have to Tableau server. So again, I don't want to get into the weeds. Let's go back to our original view, and here we are. We have our content. Now, when you get to the content, you start to actually work with permissions. And the first real person that has sort of this influence is either the project owner or the content owner. And they can essentially apply permissions to content. So how do we apply permissions to content? Well, it's pretty easy. There's one of two ways. You can either do it when you publish content, or you can do it by just putting content in a folder, and then that content will assume the permissions of that folder. So let's take a look at this metrics folder here. You'll see that I'll click on these three dots here. I'm just going to click on these three dots. And when I click on them there, you'll see that I do get this ability to open this drop down, and there's a permissions options right there. So if I click on the permissions option there, you'll see that I get this interface, and this interface is actually broken down into several areas. Now, I've called this folder metrics. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are only metrics here. I could put other content in here, but the key thing I want to call out here are these sections here at the top. So let's just go through the anatomy of the permissions window so you can understand this better. The permission window always essentially reacts to the level of access that you're at. So at this level that I'm at, I've gone into a folder, which is essentially a project. And you can see that the tab is currently highlighting projects. Now it's only really responding to projects. And if I then go and click on, say, workbooks, you'll see that it changes and I get a few more of this sort of matrix in this grid. And then if I go to data sources, I get even less, but this time it's got different icons. And you get the idea, have roles, flows, lenses, and finally metrics, which is actually what I was trying to create. So these are different content types, and each of them has a different set of permissions that you can control. So it's important to bear in mind that when you click on a project, when you go into any permissions, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're only changing the permissions for that particular thing. In this case, I've clicked on a project, so that doesn't mean I'm only changing permissions for this project. The reason that is, if I go back to the top level here and I just highlight something to you, you can actually lock permissions down to a project level. So let's go ahead and select edit here, and you can see that I have the flexibility and capability to say that any permissions that I apply here at the project level are actually propagated down to all the content and everything inside of the project. That can also include subfolders, so sub-projects or nested projects as well. So that's why I mentioned that earlier on. And so if you want to do that, that's actually quite good because it avoids mistakes happening. It avoids an author publishing something up and accidentally ticking the wrong box and enabling something for a group of users they shouldn't have enabled it for, or maybe just forgetting to set things properly inside of the workbook. By doing this, you can kind of make sure that only the right people who are supposed to see something can actually see it. I'm not going to do that here though. I'm just going to close this. We'll maybe make a separate video on just this, but I just wanted to give that overview before we move on. Now, because here I'm on projects, you can see that I only really have two options. I have the view options and the save options. And if we hover over these, it actually tells you exactly what they are. So if I hover over this, it says view. And if you hover over this one, the save icon, it means publish. So essentially what these two permissions are doing is controlling who can see the project and who can publish to the project. And you can see that at the moment, all users have the ability to publish to the project. And I also have myself here as an administrator. So you can see that I also have the ability to see and publish to the folder. Now, this is a really nice sort of part of the Tableau interface because it essentially tells you what permissions are being applied. And it's actually where you add permissions yourself. So if you wanted to add an additional group of users, you could just go to this little box here, click it. And if I go ahead and do that now, you'll see that I get an interface. I am able to choose from a drop down of different groups and or people, and I can essentially give them a specific access. I can also, go and select a group. And once I've done that, if I go down to this drop down, I'm able to then select whether I want to allow them to have a preset. So publish will only, of course, let them see and publish to the folder. If I just select view, it will let them see the project, but it won't let them save content to the project. And then none is essentially removing the permissions, and then denied is essentially blocking those things. And so you're probably wondering, well, what's the difference between none and denied? Okay, well, let's just park that for a few minutes. I'll come back to that in a second because it's really important to finish the rest of this interface before I explain the permissions flow. We'll come to that in a second. So I'm just going to leave it as none. I'm going to, in fact, in this case, if I leave it as none, you see the save option is grayed out because I technically haven't changed the permissions. So what I actually have to do is set something like denied, and then that will work. Now, because I'm a server admin, I will still be able to see this. So even if I deny myself, even though I'm in the group, new group one, if I actually click on it, you'll see that the viewer version of myself is in there. I'm actually still able to see it as an admin as well, as a separate user. So we don't have to worry too much about that. But we'll come back to the difference between none and denied in a second. Now, the last thing you can do is you can test permissions, and that's what this bottom half is for. So if we highlight this here, you'll see effective permissions. And in here, we can essentially type a group and type a set of users, and we can see what permissions are being applied to them. So if I go ahead and just type my name in here and just type in Gwenna, you'll see there's two versions of me. And like I said to you before, I'm here as a site administrator, and I'm also here as a viewer. And you can see that my viewer access has 2 X's, which means I can't see this project and I can't save to the project under this account. So this is my other account. If I was to log in, I wouldn't be able to see or publish content to this folder. If, however, I log in as a server admin, you can see that actually I can see and publish to this folder. Okay, so again, this is really quite simple. And if you've got a really complex project and a complex set of permissions, this is a great way of just checking that those permissions are working. Sometimes you can set your permissions up here in this space and you think you've got everything locked down, and you'll go down to this section and you'll test your permissions and you realize someone still can't see something, or someone can still see something. And so that's a big indicator that they've got permissions elsewhere, either as a server admin, as their role, or as a content owner. And that is actually what's changing what level of access they have. But nonetheless, let's sort of move on from this. We'll come back to this in a second when we look at workbooks, data sources, and data roles. But the next most important thing to evaluate is what is the difference between all these ticks, for example. So if I was to go in here and select none, what is the difference between having no permissions for something, being denied permissions for something, and how does Tableau evaluate? Let's say I'm in 2 groups, one which has ability to see something and one which has been denied access to see something. How does Tableau choose which one to evaluate first? For that, I want to take you to the permissions documentation by Tableau. Now, I'll put a link to this in the description below. I'll also put it up on screen. But in essence, this is a really handy guide. And if you scroll down, it goes through many of the things I'm going to cover in this video and I'll cover in subsequent series. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of things in here, but the reason I want to jump straight to this second tab here is essentially the effective permissions and how Tableau evaluates the role. So let's make this really large on screen and make sure that you can see it very easily. So let's just do this, and you can see here that it's a very sort of simple diagram. And so In any situation, when Tableau is evaluating the permissions for any content, this is essentially the simplified model of how it works. Okay, so the first thing you'll see it will do is it will evaluate whether you're trying to do something that's outside the scope of your role. So let's say I'm a viewer and I'm trying to access some content that a server admin should be able to access. And I go to look at that content. The first thing Tableau Server will do is I'll actually check that first. It'll say, hey, is the capability you're trying to access outside of the scope of a viewer in this case? And if the answer is yes, then unfortunately I'll be denied access to do that. If, however, I try and do something that a viewer should be able to do, then of course it will let me do that. And I can actually move on to the next question. So it's sort of a weird way of asking it. So if I'm trying to do something outside of my capability, the answer to that is yes, then it will block me. If not, you'll go to the next question. The next question is actually whether I'm an admin or a project leader. So if I'm a server admin or site admin or something like that, well, that gives me the access. So if yes, it will allow access. If I'm a project leader, I own one of those projects, then again, I'll be given access to that. Okay. The next most important check is whether you're a content owner. So let's say you're not a server admin, you're not an admin or a project leader. The next thing it's going to check is whether you own content. So if you published and created the content, well, of course, you should have the ability to see that content. So this is essentially an explicit permission exclusively for authors of content, just to make sure that when they publish content, they have sort of full access to do whatever they need to do for their content. Now, if they were happening to do this inside of a project where the permissions were locked, then in fact, this permission here would get a little bit more complex. And there's a separate diagram for that, which I'll show you in a second. But nonetheless, the content owner here typically tends to have access to their own content. Okay. Now, the next thing is if you are not the content owner, then are you denied as a user? So the first thing it's then going to check, having gone through these three sort of role-based permissions, is then to figure out, well, look, have you been denied access? Has someone said that you shouldn't see this? Okay, so notice that it asks that first. It asks first whether you've been denied access, which means if we go back to our previous tab here, and we were to go back to all users here, and we thought we were doing a safe thing by denying everyone access to the server like this, and then we went and then added a specific group like Data Rockstars into this group, and we gave them publish permissions, what do you think would happen here? Well, hopefully you answered that question, but in essence, the Data Rockstars would still not be able to publish or do anything because they have been denied access. Remember, in this flow, it first checks whether a user has been denied access. And if they have, it denies them immediately. It doesn't go on to the rest of the flow to check whether they've been allowed access. So that's a super important distinction. I can't tell you how many times whilst working as a consultant, this has been the simple fix for lots of permission errors. Someone has, gone in here and smashed the X because they don't want to make a mistake, but actually what they've done is locked pretty much everyone, out. So what you can do instead is if you want to do this, you'll actually go to all users and give them no permissions. I'll save that and I'll explain why giving them no permissions is almost the same as denying them permissions, but it works in a slightly better way. So let me go back to the permissions flow and let's finish working through. Okay, so we've checked whether the user is allowed access. If they're denied, then of course we'll deny them. If they're allowed, then it will give them access. So if, let's say, I was to go back to this view and I was in the Data Rockstar group, but I'd been specifically denied access. So let's save that as a Data Rockstar group. So let's say the Data Rockstar group has been denied access, but then I go and add the other version of myself, this version here, and I go and give them publish access. So you can see here that even though Tim here is in the Data Rockstar group, you'll see that actually what's going to happen because of this workflow is that it's going to check first if the user is allowed access. So I can technically block a group and then explicitly add permissions for a single user in that group, give them access to something, and it will still work because Tableau will check first for the permissions for a user before it checks them for a group. So you can see here, if the user is allowed access, it allows it, okay? So the next thing to check is, okay, after that, it finally starts to check the group permissions. So first it checks whether the user is part of a denied group. If they are in a denied group, then it will deny them access. And if they're in an allowed group, it will allow them access, okay? And very finally, if they have no permissions whatsoever, if they've gone all the way through this tree and they still don't have any sort of permissions, then of course it's going to by default deny them access. which is why earlier on, when I looked at this page, I told you that, listen, by giving all users the none template, essentially, if Tableau can't find the permissions for a user, by default, it denies them access anyway. Okay, so you don't need to sort of worry or stress about that. The safest thing you can do is actually just remove access for everyone and essentially no one can see anything, rather than going gung-ho and sort of blocking access for everything because you think it's the safest way to do that. So that permissions flow is super, super important. It's a very simple flow that you can work through, and you can also use it for troubleshooting because it does, of course, get a little bit more complex. And actually, Tableau have sort of acknowledged that in this diagram, because if we keep scrolling down, you'll see there is actually a slightly more sort of complicated version of the same workflow. And what this does is it works at multiple levels. It also looks at content, it looks at site roles, and it basically looks at everything that's going on. And so if we go through this one, we can sort of evaluate this in a little bit more detail. So let's take this to level 2 and really try and sort of understand what's going on. So first thing we do is we actually start here. We always start here at the top or on the left. It's the simplest way to sort of evaluate the workflow. So again, it checks the capabilities outside of the role. Okay, we've done this. This section here looks pretty similar to what we saw before, but this is where things get interesting. Okay, after we've checked whether the person is an admin or a project leader, the next thing it's going to ask is whether the permissions are locked to the project. Now, remember earlier on I said that if I went back in here and I selected the edit option just here, if I went into that, I could lock the permissions to the project here at the top. And if I do that, you see you get this warning saying project permissions will be applied to all content and all nested projects in metrics when you save. Now, when I do that, this workflow is probably more appropriate, because if it is locked to the permissions, locked to the project, it can't go evaluating the flow as it was, because of course what I've done by locking the permissions to the project is I've potentially overwritten any other permissions that were embedded in content put into that folder or in subsequent sort of levels and settings that maybe, for example, a content owner could have published. So if the permissions are locked to the project, then it will then go through here and check, well, are you the content owner for this content? And if you are the content owner, it will give you access. There is an exception there, but again, I'm keeping this simple. Let's just keep moving. And then having checked if you're a content owner, it will then go and see, okay, well, let's check this at a project permission level and ask, are you denied as a user? If yes, then it will deny you. Are you allowed as a user? Allowed and denied as a group, denied, allowed as a group, allowed. And then as we go through here, he goes no, and everything comes out of this end. However, if the project permissions are not locked to a project, so if this tick box here is the same as it is now, then when we go back to this workflow, we go to the right. It checks again to see if you're a content owner. And if you are, it allows you access. So in many ways, this permission and this permission are kind of doing the same thing. They're just two different branches. And what we then do is we go to this next question, which is permission rule on view. Okay, so the permission rule on the view is actually something sort of very niche. I'm going to skip it for this particular video because I need to just show you this example, and I haven't got an example set up, and I think it would take a bit more time. So I'll do a separate video just on that. But essentially, it's asking whether you've got specific permission for a view in a published sort of environment. Okay, and if you have the permissions for that, and then it goes down, and then it will check all these other permissions. Okay, now, if no, then it asks if you have a permission rule on a workbook, data source, or flow. So essentially what it's doing is it's going through the individual bits of content and it's checking whether you have permission to that thing. And once you do have a permission to that thing, it's evaluating what permission you have. So you can see that every time it says yes along sort of this bottom row, it's essentially throwing you out to the same check it would have done anyway for the user, then the group. And so it's really important to sort of acknowledge that, look, when you lock content to a project, in some ways it's sort of simplifying the permission model, because you don't have to go hunting around to figure out what permissions are working. However, if you don't do that, then essentially what it has to do is for each individual item, it has to evaluate the level of access that you have and check that what that's doing. Now, that's not going to eat up resources. Look, this all happens in the flash of an eye. It's not like the kind of thing where, you know, adding more complex permissions is going to make it sort of slower or anything like that. It all happens very, very quickly, and it's evaluated very easily by the Tableau server. But nonetheless, I think it's an important workflow to understand to be able to troubleshoot. So those are the effective permissions, and this is how they're applied. Now, to end this video, I'm just going to go back and we're just going to finish this setup. So you see here, I'm still looking at the permissions at the metrics level. So I clicked on the three dots and went to the permissions for the metrics folder. And you can see that in here, I can, of course, go in and set some permissions across the whole entire folder. And again, this is all related to this metrics folder. If I close this down and I go into the metrics folder, you'll see that I have a bunch of metrics in here. And so if I click on the three dots here and I go to permissions, you can see that now I'm inside of the permissions specifically for this metric. And notice that I have a lot less going on. I don't have that tab here across the top, which will show me the different levels of content. And so as you go further into a project, or as you engage more with content and you try and edit their individual permissions, you obviously lose more of a high level of control because you're getting more and more niche into a particular thing. And so each of those things will have its own set of permissions. So let's take a look at a few of those and see what they look like. So this is what the metrics permissions look like. If I was to go back out of this, and if I go back to the 2020.2 release, I think I do have some data sources. So let's go to this data source here. I'll click on permissions, and you can see that here I get the data source set of permissions here. They're very different. They are the what are these? The view, the connect, the download data source, overwrite, move, delete, and set permissions. Now, I will say very briefly, this set permissions is super dangerous because essentially you can give someone access to change their own permissions. So be super careful with that setting and who you give it to. But nonetheless, again, these are the data specific settings. Now, if I go back out and I go to Viz, for example, this one, and I go to permissions, you'll see that again, I get a different set of permissions. I don't get that little tab across the top because I'm now in the workbook permissions. So in the workbook permissions, we have probably the most complicated set of permissions because of course, this is the most sort of fleshed out part of Tableau. And so it's added all these controls over the years, and they're generally broken down into a bunch of areas. Now, you can sort of play around with these templates because of course, the templates I showed you earlier were specific to the project. If I click on this drop down, you can see that there's actually a few more templates. So if I, for example, select the Explore, you can see that it gives pretty much all of these settings. Now, these are kind of matching the roles. So Explorer, for example, would be able to do all of this. If I go down and just select View, this is sort of simulating what a viewer would be able to do. That's strictly not always true, but generally speaking, that's how you can sort of assume it works. If I hit Publish, I get this sort of hybrid, which is essentially what an Explorer can do, as well as this information here. So I can go in and download and save a copy of the workbook. I can set I can overwrite the content, and I can also create and refresh metrics myself, okay? And then the very last thing is administer, which gives me everything for this content. So if I give someone the ability to administer a piece of content, they can also change these permissions for the content themselves, okay? So I'm not going to change those. I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to set this to none as I suggested earlier. If I delete the rule, then it actually just disappears, okay? And it just doesn't do anything. But I can go ahead and set this up and just give everyone, I'll give everyone view access actually as a simple one because I'm on this server and this is all going to be fine, okay? So as a starting point, I really hope this has given you some sort of overview of how the permissions are evaluated, where the permissions are, and how you can change them. Now, by no means have I covered every single thing. We didn't go into groups, we didn't go into users, we didn't go into any of that. We just kept it focused on permissions itself. But hopefully this video has been enough to get you started and understanding where potential permissions issues might be, okay? So this is the point where I need your help. We need some sort of scope for the next video because the problem with permissions is you can take it literally anywhere. And so what I will do is I'll pledge to make the next permission video within the next month or two. But in order to do that, I'm going to be watching the comments on this video to see, look, what are the most sort of needed questions that need answering when it comes to permissions. And I'll also sort of open the invite for other questions on Tableau server that you might be interested in. I'm going to try and avoid the backend tasks just for now. I do have a Tableau server certification up for renewal next year. So when I start to go through that, I will make lots of back-end content for that. But for now, I just want to keep things simple and keep it on the user interface where, to be honest, most people spend their time. Most people looking at content are going to be managing content as well. So we'll focus on that at least for now this year. And then next year we can get all hands on. I'll even buy a Tableau server and we'll get sort of hacky on AWS and do a whole bunch of stuff. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to share it with people if you found it useful as well. If it's a great resource for you, then I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Yeah, I'd really love to know what else you'd like to see on the channel. So let me know in the comments. Be sure to check out tableautim.com, where I have a host of playlists that are hopefully helpful about Tableau and other content. And yeah, if you'd like me to make videos about other pieces of software, also let me know what you'd like those to be. I'd be interested to know. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.